The gunshot shattered the midnight silence of Angel's Camp, California, like a promise being broken. Luke O'Connor's hand instinctively moved to his holster as he stepped from the saloon into the dusty street, his keen eyes scanning the darkness for the source of the disturbance. It was 1873, and trouble in this mining town was as common as fool's gold, but something about that particular shot sent a chill down his spine. Luke had earned his reputation as one of the fastest guns in Calaveras County, though not by choice. At 32, the lines around his eyes told stories of hardships endured across the unforgiving frontier. His dark hair, streaked with premature gray at the temples, was typically hidden beneath a well-worn Stetson that had weathered as many storms as its owner. Another shot rang out, followed by raucous laughter coming from the direction of the wagon yard behind Foster's General Store. Luke's jaw tightened. The wagon yard served as a temporary holding place for travelers passing through Angel's Camp, and it wasn't unusual for men to get rowdy after a long journey. But something in his gut told him this was different. "You headin' over there, O'Connor," called Sheriff Wilson from the jailhouse porch. "Just going to make sure no one's causing too much trouble, Bill," Luke replied, his voice carrying the calm authority that had made him the sheriff's most trusted deputy. The wagon yard was dimly lit by a single lantern hanging from a post. As Luke approached, he could make out the silhouettes of 3 men standing in a semicircle, passing a bottle between them. Their attention was focused on something or someone on the ground. "Evening, gentlemen," Luke called out, his hand resting casually on his holster. "Seems like you're having quite a celebration." The men turned, and Luke recognized them as drovers who had arrived with a cattle shipment earlier that day. The leader, a burly man with a patchy beard, stepped forward. "Ain't nothing that concerns you, mister," he slurred. Luke moved closer, and that's when he saw her. A woman was huddled on the ground, her wrists bound with thick rope that connected to a chain secured to a wagon wheel. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, and even in the dim light, Luke could see the bruises forming on her face. Her eyes, wide with terror, locked with his, silently pleading. "I believe it does concern me," Luke said, his voice dropping dangerously low. "I'm Deputy O'Connor, and you boys are breaking about half a dozen laws I can think of." "She's property," argued the second drover, a lanky man with a scar running down his cheek. "Won fair and square in a poker game in Sacramento." "No human being is property," Luke replied, his hand now gripping his pistol. "Not anymore, not in this country." The third man, younger than the others but with a mean look in his eyes, spat on the ground. "She's a thief. Stole from my brother's store. He gave her to us instead of the law." Luke knew it was a lie the moment the words left the man's mouth, but he kept his expression neutral. "That's so. Well, in Angel's Camp, we have a proper justice system, so I'll be taking her now, and you boys can explain yourselves to Sheriff Wilson in the morning." The leader's hand twitched toward his gun. "There's 3 of us and 1 of you, deputy." Luke's revolver cleared its holster with a speed that left the drovers blinking. "I like those odds," he said quietly. "Now step away from the lady." For a tense moment, Luke thought they might draw. Then the leader raised his hands in surrender. "Fine. Take the trouble. She ain't worth dying over." "Smart decision," Luke nodded. "Now get going. I expect to see you at the sheriff's office at sunrise." The men grumbled but retreated, staggering toward the saloon. Luke holstered his weapon and quickly knelt beside the woman, whose breathing came in short, panicked gasps. "It's all right, madam," he said gently, pulling his knife from his boot. "I'm going to cut these ropes. You're safe now." As the blade sliced through her bindings, Luke got his first clear look at her face. Despite the dirt and bruises, he could see she was beautiful, with delicate features and deep, expressive eyes that reminded him of the mountain lakes he'd fished as a boy. Her hair, the color of chestnuts in autumn, fell in tangled waves around her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered as the ropes fell away, her voice hoarse but cultured, suggesting an education uncommon in these parts. She rubbed her raw wrists, wincing. "What's your name, madam?" Luke asked, offering his handkerchief for a cut on her cheek. "Elizabeth," she replied, accepting the cloth with trembling fingers. "Elizabeth Porter. Miss Porter, I'm Luke O'Connor. Can you stand?" She nodded and attempted to rise, but her legs buckled beneath her. Luke caught her gently by the shoulders. "Easy now," he said. "How long have they had you tied up like this?" "Since yesterday," Elizabeth answered, her voice stronger now. They took me from the stagecoach in Sonora, said I was payment for a debt my father owed." Luke's expression darkened. "Your father owes these men." "No," she shook her head firmly. "My father is Pastor James Porter from Boston. He's never been west of the Mississippi. These men are lying." Luke believed her. He'd seen enough of the world to recognize honest eyes when they met his. "We need to get you somewhere safe, Miss Porter. Can you walk if I help you?" Elizabeth nodded again, and Luke supported her with an arm around her waist. They moved slowly through the wagon yard toward the sheriff's office. "They'll come back," she said suddenly, fear creeping into her voice. "Not tonight they won't," Luke assured her. "And tomorrow we'll sort this whole thing out proper." But as they passed under the dim glow of a street lamp, Luke caught sight of a brand on her upper arm, partially visible through the torn fabric of her dress, the kind of mark human traffickers used to identify their merchandise. His stomach turned. This wasn't a simple case of mistaken identity or debt collection. Elizabeth Porter had been captured by men who dealt in human lives, and that meant her troubles and his were just beginning. The sheriff's office was quiet when they arrived, the lone cell empty for once. Sheriff Wilson looked up from his paperwork, his bushy eyebrows rising at the sight of Luke supporting the battered woman. "Good Lord, what happened here?" he asked, rushing to clear a chair for Elizabeth. Luke helped her sit before explaining the situation. Wilson's face grew progressively darker as he listened. "Slave traders," he spat. "Thought we'd stamp that out with the war." "It went underground," Luke replied grimly. "Different name, same evil." Elizabeth's hands twisted in her lap. "They said they were taking me to San Francisco. That there was a house there that would pay well for a woman with education." Wilson shook his head disgustedly. "Miss Porter, you're safe now. We'll send a telegram to your father in Boston first thing in the morning." "Thank you," she said, "but I have no way to pay for my passage home. Everything I had was in my trunk on the stagecoach." "Let's worry about that later," Luke suggested. "Right now, you need rest and medical attention." The sheriff nodded. "Mrs. Wilson can put her up for the night. Our daughter's room has been empty since she married and moved to Sacramento." Luke escorted Elizabeth to the sheriff's house, where Mrs. Wilson, a kind-faced woman with silver-streaked hair, took one look at the young woman and immediately set about preparing a bath and fresh clothes. "You did right bringing her here, Luke," Mrs. Wilson said as she bustled about. "Some men in this town would have looked the other way." Luke tipped his hat. "I'll be back in the morning to check on her. Those drovers promised to come by and explain themselves, though I suspect they'll be halfway to Nevada by sunrise." As he turned to leave, Elizabeth called out to him. "Deputy O'Connor." He paused at the door. "Yes, Miss Porter." Her eyes, though tired, held a steady determination that impressed him. "Thank you for cutting those ropes. I believe you've changed my life tonight." Luke felt something stir in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. "Just doing my job, madam," he replied softly. "Get some rest now." But as he walked back to his small cabin on the edge of town, Luke O'Connor knew it was more than just duty that had compelled him to intervene. Something about Elizabeth Porter called to him, awakening parts of his soul he'd thought long dead after the war and years of frontier justice. The night felt different somehow, as if the stars themselves were rearranging their ancient patterns to tell a new story. Luke gazed up at them, wondering what the coming days would bring. One thing was certain. By cutting those ropes, he hadn't just changed Elizabeth Porter's life, he'd irrevocably altered his own. The following morning dawned clear and bright over Angel's Camp. Luke rose early, as was his habit, and prepared for what promised to be an eventful day. After washing and shaving with particular care, he donned his cleanest shirt before pinning his deputy's badge to his vest. As expected, the drovers failed to appear at the sheriff's office. A quick check at the livery confirmed Luke's suspicion they had departed before first light, leaving behind unpaid boarding fees and a stable boy nursing a bruised jaw from attempting to stop them. Figured as much, Sheriff Wilson sighed when Luke reported this news. Well, at least they're gone. How's the girl? I'm heading to check on her now, Luke replied. Did you send that telegram to Boston? Wilson nodded. First thing this morning. Could be days before we hear back, though. Luke left the office and made his way to the sheriff's modest home, where Mrs. Wilson greeted him with a knowing smile. She's in the garden, the older woman said. Poor thing's been through an ordeal, but she's stronger than she looks. Luke found Elizabeth seated on a bench beneath a flowering apple tree. The transformation from the previous night was remarkable. Cleaned up and dressed in one of Mrs. Wilson's daughter's old dresses, altered hastily, but skillfully, by the sheriff's wife, Elizabeth looked every bit the refined Eastern lady she claimed to be. Her chestnut hair was neatly arranged, and though bruises still marred her fair skin, her posture spoke of resilience rather than defeat. She looked up as he approached, and a small smile brightened her face. Deputy O'Connor, Mrs. Wilson said you might call this morning. Please call me Luke, he said, removing his hat. How are you feeling, Miss Porter? Better, thank you, and you must call me Elizabeth. She gestured to the space beside her on the bench. The sheriff told me those men left town. Luke sat, placing his hat on his knee. They did. Cowards usually run when faced with consequences. Then it's over, she asked, hope tinging her voice. Luke hesitated. He didn't want to frighten her, but he couldn't lie either. Those particular men may be gone, but I saw the brand they marked you with. They're part of a larger operation. Elizabeth's hand unconsciously moved to her upper arm, where the mark was now hidden beneath her sleeve. Mrs. Wilson tried to treat it with salve, but she says it will scar. I'm sorry, Luke said sincerely. It's not your fault. Elizabeth gazed out at the garden. Sheriff Wilson sent a telegram to my father, but I've been thinking. I'm not sure returning to Boston is what I want anymore. Luke raised an eyebrow. No, I thought you'd be eager to put this place behind you after what happened. That's just it, she explained, her eyes meeting his with unexpected determination. What happened to me is happening to other women too, isn't it? Luke nodded grimly. I'm afraid so. Then how can I simply return to my sheltered life in Boston, attending socials and pretending the world is all tea parties and literature discussions? Elizabeth's voice grew passionate. I came west because I wanted adventure, yes, but also because I felt stifled. My father arranged a marriage for me to the son of his most generous parishioner, a man twice my age who views women as decorative possessions. So you ran away, Luke concluded. I prefer to think of it as seeking my own path, Elizabeth replied with a hint of defiance. I had plans to become a schoolteacher in California. I have the education for it. Luke studied her face, impressed by her spirit despite everything she'd endured. Angel's Camp could use a good teacher, he said thoughtfully. The mining families have children who get precious little schooling. Hope flickered in Elizabeth's eyes. Do you really think that's possible? I don't see why not. The town council's been trying to establish a proper school for years, but qualified teachers are hard to come by in these parts. Their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Wilson calling them in for lunch. As they shared a simple but hearty meal, Elizabeth asked questions about Angel's Camp and its people, absorbing every detail with genuine interest. Luke found himself enjoying her company more than he'd expected, admiring both her intelligence and her remarkable resilience. After lunch, Luke offered to show Elizabeth around town. Sheriff Wilson had concerns about her safety, but Luke assured him they'd stay in public areas. Besides, he added, patting his holster, no one's going to bother her with me around. The small mining town buzzed with activity as Luke guided Elizabeth through its dusty streets. Miners, merchants, and families went about their business, many tipping their hats or nodding respectfully to Luke. Several cast curious glances at Elizabeth, word of her rescue having spread quickly through the close-knit community. It seems everyone knows what happened, Elizabeth observed as they passed a group of whispering women outside the millinery shop. Small towns don't keep secrets well, Luke admitted, but these people are good at heart. They're just curious about the Eastern lady rescued by their deputy. Elizabeth's cheeks colored slightly. You make it sound so dramatic, isn't it? Luke smiled. It's not every day a cowboy finds a woman chained in the wagon yard. Despite herself, Elizabeth laughed a genuine musical sound that caught Luke by surprise. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh, and something about it warmed him from the inside out. They continued their tour, stopping at Foster's General Store, where the proprietor, Harold Foster, greeted them warmly. "Miss Porter, it's an honor," the round-faced shopkeeper said. "Terrible business. What happened to you? If there's anything you need while you're in Angel's Camp, you just let me know." "That's very kind, Mr. Foster," Elizabeth replied. As they browsed the store's wares, Elizabeth paused by a display of schoolbooks. She ran her fingers over a primer, her expression thoughtful. "I was serious about the teaching position," Luke said, watching her. "The town council meets tomorrow evening. I could speak to them on your behalf." Elizabeth turned to him, her eyes bright with possibility. "Would you?" "I know it's presumptuous of me to consider staying after knowing this place for barely a day, but something feels right about it." Luke understood perfectly. He'd experienced the same feeling when he first arrived in Angel's Camp 5 years earlier, weary from the war and searching for a place to belong. "Sometimes the heart knows what it wants before the head catches up," he said simply. As the afternoon waned, they made their way to the ridge overlooking town. The view was spectacular, rolling hills dotted with pines stretching toward the distant Sierra Nevada mountains, their peaks still capped with snow even in late spring. "It's beautiful," Elizabeth breathed, taking in the vista. "Different from Boston, I imagine," Luke said, standing beside her. "Completely different," she agreed. "Boston has its own beauty, the harbor, the historic buildings, the gardens, but this feels like freedom." Luke glanced at her profile, struck by how the golden light of the setting sun illuminated her features. Despite her bruises, there was a glow about her, an inner strength that adversity had failed to diminish. "Freedom comes with risks," he warned gently. "The West isn't always kind, especially to those who don't understand its ways." "I'm learning quickly," Elizabeth replied, "and I have a good teacher." She smiled up at him, and Luke felt that unfamiliar stirring in his chest again. Their moment was interrupted by the distant sound of hoof beats. Luke's hand instinctively moved to his pistol as he scanned the road leading into town. A cloud of dust announced the arrival of riders, at least half a dozen, moving fast. "We should head back," he said, his relaxed demeanor shifting to alertness in an instant. Elizabeth sensed the change and asked no questions as they quickly descended toward town. By the time they reached the main street, the riders had arrived, 6 rough-looking men led by a tall figure in a black duster. They dismounted outside the saloon, drawing curious stares from townsfolk. Luke guided Elizabeth toward the sheriff's office, keeping her partially shielded behind him. As they passed the newcomers, the leader, a cold-eyed man with a meticulously trimmed beard, looked directly at them. His gaze lingered on Elizabeth with a calculating intensity that made Luke's blood run cold. Inside the sheriff's office, they found Wilson cleaning his shotgun. He looked up at their hasty entrance. "Trouble?" he asked, noting Luke's expression. "Maybe," Luke replied. 6 riders just came in. Don't recognize them, but their leader took too much interest in Miss Porter for my liking." Wilson set down his shotgun and reached for his hat. "I'll go have a friendly chat with our visitors. You get Miss Porter back to my house. Martha will keep her company while we sort this out." Luke nodded and turned to Elizabeth, whose face had paled. "Those men," she whispered. "The one in the black coat, I saw him in Sacramento, watching from across the street when the drovers took me from the stagecoach." Luke and Wilson exchanged grim looks. "Seems those drovers were just the hired help," the sheriff said. "This could be the real operator come to collect his merchandise." Elizabeth shuddered at the word, and Luke placed a protective hand on her shoulder. "He's not getting anywhere near you," he promised. "I'll stake my life on that." "Let's hope it doesn't come to that," Wilson replied. "Luke, take the back streets to my house. I'll handle our visitors." As they slipped out the rear door of the sheriff's office, Luke could feel Elizabeth trembling beside him. The day's brightness had vanished, replaced by the encroaching shadows of evening and a new, dangerous uncertainty. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly as they hurried through an alley. "I've brought trouble to your town." Luke stopped and turned to her, his expression serious. "Listen to me, Elizabeth. You have nothing to apologize for. The only people at fault are the ones who think they can treat human beings like property." She looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Why are you helping me? You could have just left me in the wagon yard, or handed me over to the sheriff and washed your hands of the whole business." The question caught Luke off guard. He had been acting on instinct since the moment he saw her chained to that wagon wheel, not examining his motivations too closely. But faced with her direct inquiry, he found himself searching for an honest answer. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally. "And because when I saw you there, something inside me couldn't bear the thought of walking away." A single tear escaped down Elizabeth's cheek, and Luke gently brushed it away with his thumb. The gesture was intimate, perhaps more than was proper, but neither of them seemed to mind. For a brief moment, the danger around them faded into the background as something unspoken passed between them, a connection deeper than their short acquaintance should allow. The spell was broken by the sound of a door slamming nearby. Luke quickly guided Elizabeth onward, and within minutes they reached the sheriff's house, where Mrs. Wilson received them with concerned efficiency. "I heard about the newcomers," she said, ushering Elizabeth inside. "Don't you worry, dear. No one's getting past my doorstep without a reckoning." Luke couldn't help smiling at the diminutive woman's fierce protectiveness. "I believe you, Mrs. Wilson. I need to get back and help the sheriff, but I'll return as soon as I can." Before he could leave, Elizabeth caught his hand. "Be careful, Luke," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "These men, they're dangerous in ways you might not expect." Luke squeezed her hand reassuringly. "So am I when necessary." With that, he headed back toward town, his mind racing with possibilities. If the man in the black duster was indeed connected to a trafficking ring, This situation had just become far more complex than a simple rescue. Such operations typically had connections in high places, corrupt officials, wealthy clients, and enough muscle to enforce their will. Angel's Camp had enjoyed relative peace in recent years, but Luke knew that peace was about to be tested. As he approached the saloon where the newcomers had gathered, he mentally prepared himself for what might become the most dangerous confrontation of his life since the war. Inside the saloon, Sheriff Wilson was engaged in seemingly casual conversation with the bearded man in the black duster. The other 5 riders were scattered around the room, nursing drinks but remaining alert. Luke entered quietly, acknowledging Wilson with a slight nod before positioning himself near the bar, where he could observe the entire room. "As I was saying, Mr. Reynolds," the sheriff continued, "Angel's Camp welcomes visitors, but we're particular about the kind of business conducted here." The man called Reynolds smiled thinly. "I assure you, Sheriff, my business interests are perfectly legitimate. I'm a trader in various commodities, currently tracking down some inventory that went missing between Sacramento and San Francisco." "What kind of inventory might that be?" Wilson asked, his tone remaining conversational despite the tension Luke could see in his shoulders. Reynolds took a slow sip of whiskey. "Nothing that would concern local law enforcement. A private matter between me and the individuals who misplaced my property." "Well, Mr. Reynolds," Wilson said, setting down his empty glass, "Angel's Camp is a small town. Not much happens here without me knowing about it. If you're looking for something specific, perhaps I can help point you in the right direction." The trader's eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm looking for a woman. Young, attractive, educated. She would have arrived in town recently, possibly in the company of men who might have presented her as their companion." Luke kept his expression neutral, though his hand inched closer to his holster beneath the bar. The sheriff, to his credit, didn't so much as blink at the description that so obviously matched Elizabeth. "Can't say that rings any bells," Wilson replied. "Most newcomers pass through on the stage or with the mining supply caravans. We did have some cattle drovers come through yesterday, but they left this morning." Reynolds studied Wilson's face. "Indeed. That's unfortunate. These drovers were transporting valuable property on my behalf. If they've absconded with it, that would constitute theft of a significant magnitude." "Theft is a serious accusation," Luke interjected, drawing the trader's cold gaze. "Do you have documentation proving ownership of this property?" Reynolds regarded Luke with new interest. "And you are Deputy O'Connor," Luke replied evenly. "Deputy," Reynolds nodded. "To answer your question, I have contracts and bills of sale that would satisfy any reasonable inquiry. However, I prefer to resolve such matters privately when possible. Perhaps you've noticed something your sheriff hasn't." The question was a test. Luke knew. He shook his head. "I make it a point to notice everything in this town, Mr. Reynolds. No one matching your description has come to my attention." A flash of annoyance crossed Reynolds' face, quickly replaced by his practiced smile. "Well, I appreciate your honesty. My associates and I will be staying in town for a day or two, continuing our inquiries. I trust that won't be a problem." "Not at all," Sheriff Wilson said. "The hotel down the street is clean and reasonably priced. Just remember, Angel's Camp is peaceful, and we aim to keep it that way." The warning in Wilson's voice was subtle but unmistakable. Reynolds inclined his head in acknowledgement before finishing his drink and signaling to his men. They filed out of the saloon, leaving behind a heavy silence. Once they were gone, the sheriff moved closer to Luke. "He knows she's here," he said quietly. "Without a doubt," Luke agreed. "And he's not leaving without her, or trying, at least." Wilson rubbed his graying mustache thoughtfully. We need to find out more about this Reynolds character. I've got a friend in the U.S., Marshal's office in Sacramento. I'll send a telegram first thing in the morning. In the meantime, Luke asked. In the meantime, we keep Miss Porter safe and out of sight. Martha can help with that. And we make sure Reynolds understands that throwing his weight around in Angel's camp is a poor decision. Luke nodded. I'll take first watch tonight at your place, if that's all right. Wilson clasped his shoulder. I figured you'd say that. Go on back and ease the ladies' minds. I'll keep an eye on our visitors for now. As Luke left the saloon, the evening air felt heavy with foreboding. Stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, but their familiar patterns offered no comfort tonight. Something told him that before this business was concluded, blood would be spilled on the dusty streets of Angel's camp. At the Wilson home, he found Elizabeth and Mrs. Wilson sitting in the parlor, the older woman teaching her young charge how to knit, a domestic scene that contrasted sharply with the danger Luke knew was circling them. Elizabeth looked up as he entered, her needlework forgotten. What happened? Luke sat down, accepting a cup of coffee from Mrs. Wilson. The man in black is called Reynolds. He's looking for you, though we didn't confirm or deny your presence in town. Did he say why he wants me? Elizabeth asked, her voice remarkably steady. He referred to you as property and inventory, Luke replied, not softening the truth. He claims to have documentation proving ownership. Elizabeth's hands clenched in her lap. That's impossible. No one owns me. Of course not, Mrs. Wilson said firmly. The very idea is preposterous in this day and age. Luke leaned forward. Elizabeth, I need you to tell me everything you can remember about your abduction. Any details might help us understand who this Reynolds is and what he's really after. Elizabeth took a deep breath, collecting her thoughts. I arrived in Sacramento 3 days ago on the Transcontinental Railroad. I had arranged passage on the stagecoach to San Francisco, where I planned to apply for teaching positions. While waiting for the stage, I was approached by a well-dressed woman who offered to show me to a respectable boarding house where I could refresh myself before the journey. She paused, embarrassment crossing her features. I was naive. I followed her to what I thought was a boarding house, but once inside I was drugged, I believe. My tea tasted strange. The next thing I remember clearly was being in a wagon with those drovers, my hands bound and a gag in my mouth. Did you see Reynolds in Sacramento before the abduction? Luke asked. Elizabeth nodded slowly. Yes, now that I think about it. He was watching from across the street when I disembarked from the train. I noticed him because he was so well dressed compared to the other men at the station, and because he seemed to be staring directly at me. I assumed he was simply being improper, as some men are when they see a woman traveling alone. He targeted you specifically, Luke concluded grimly. This wasn't a random abduction. But why me? Elizabeth asked, genuine confusion in her eyes. I'm not wealthy or important. Luke considered this. You mentioned your father is a pastor in Boston. Is he prominent, connected to influential people? He's respected in certain circles, Elizabeth acknowledged. His congregation includes several wealthy families and some politicians, but surely that's not enough reason to traffic his daughter across the country. Unless someone's trying to send a message, Luke suggested, or extract something from him. Mrs. Wilson, who had been listening intently, spoke up. There's another possibility. Sometimes these traffickers seek specific types for their wealthy clients. An educated, refined young woman from a good family might fetch a high price in certain establishments. Elizabeth paled at the implication, and Luke shot Mrs. Wilson a warning look. Whatever the reason, he said firmly, it doesn't matter now. You're safe, and we intend to keep you that way. But for how long? Elizabeth asked. I can't hide forever, and I won't put you and the Wilsons in danger indefinitely." "Let us worry about that," Luke replied. "For now, you should rest. I'll be keeping watch tonight, and tomorrow we'll know more once the sheriff hears back from the marshal's office." Mrs. Wilson stood, announcing it was time to prepare dinner. Luke moved to help Elizabeth rise from her chair, and as their hands met, he felt that same inexplicable connection that had sparked between them on the ridge. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." "I made you a promise," Luke reminded her, "and I don't break my promises." Their eyes held for a moment longer than necessary, and Luke found himself noticing details he'd missed before: the flecks of gold in her hazel eyes, the delicate curve of her jawline, the small scar near her right eyebrow that hinted at a childhood mishap. In another time, another place, he might have allowed himself to explore the feelings stirring within him. But right now, keeping her alive took precedence over any personal inclinations. Still, as they moved into the dining room for Mrs. Wilson's hearty stew, Luke couldn't help but wonder what might be possible once this danger had passed if Elizabeth chose to stay in Angel's camp, if she truly did become the town schoolteacher, if the connection between them continued to grow. It was a future worth fighting for, he decided. And fight he would, against Reynolds and anyone else who threatened the freedom of the remarkable woman who had so unexpectedly entered his life. The night passed uneventfully, with Luke maintaining his vigil from the Wilsons' front porch. Reynolds and his men remained at the hotel, though Luke noticed them taking turns watching the sheriff's house from various vantage points throughout the night. By morning, it was clear they knew Elizabeth's location. They were simply biding their time. Sheriff Wilson returned from the telegraph office with a grim expression. "Got word back from Marshal Jenkins in Sacramento," he said, joining Luke and Elizabeth at the breakfast table. "This Reynolds character is James Reynolds, suspected of running a trafficking operation that stretches from New Orleans to San Francisco. The marshal's been after him for years, but Reynolds has powerful protection judges, politicians, even a few lawmen on his payroll. So the law can't touch him." Elizabeth asked, setting down her coffee cup. "Not easily," Wilson admitted, "but Jenkins is sending 2 deputy marshals. They should arrive on tomorrow's stage, assuming they don't encounter any delays." The implication was clear: Reynolds might have men watching the roads. "That's not soon enough," Luke said. "Reynolds knows she's here. He's just waiting for the right moment to make his move." Wilson nodded. "I've deputized the Peterson brothers and old Jake Miller. We'll set up a rotation, keep the house guarded day and night." "I appreciate your efforts, Sheriff," Elizabeth said, "but I won't have this town turned into a battleground on my account." "It's not just on your account, Miss Porter," Wilson replied kindly. "Reynolds represents everything decent folk stand against. If he's allowed to operate freely here, Angel's camp will never be the same." After breakfast, Luke suggested moving Elizabeth to his cabin on the outskirts of town. "It's more defensible than here," he explained. "Single approach, good visibility, and Reynolds might not know about it yet." Wilson considered the idea. "It's risky moving her, but staying put might be riskier. What do you think, Miss Porter?" Elizabeth looked between the two men. "I trust Luke's judgment." The decision made, they prepared for the transfer. Mrs. Wilson packed food and supplies while Luke scouted the route, ensuring it was clear. They would move at midday, when most of the town would be occupied with their daily affairs and Reynolds' men might be less vigilant. The plan worked perfectly almost. Luke led Elizabeth through back alleys and service yards, avoiding the main streets. They were within sight of the trail leading to his cabin when a voice called out behind them. "Leaving town so soon, Miss Porter?" Without saying goodbye. They turned to find Reynolds standing casually at the mouth of the alley, alone but undoubtedly with backup nearby. Luke stepped in front of Elizabeth, his hand on his holster. "Mr. Reynolds, I believe the sheriff made it clear that Angel's Camp doesn't welcome your kind of business." Reynolds smiled, unperturbed by Luke's hostile stance. "Deputy O'Connor, you strike me as a practical man. Perhaps we can come to an arrangement that benefits us both." "There's no arrangement to be made," Luke replied coldly. "Oh, but there is," Reynolds insisted. "Miss Porter represents a significant investment. I'm prepared to offer you $500 more money than you likely see in a year of deputy work to simply step aside and forget you ever met her." Luke's expression remained stony. "Not interested." Reynolds sighed theatrically. "I anticipated your initial reluctance. Let me increase my offer to $1,000, with the added guarantee that neither you nor anyone else in Angel's Camp will face repercussions for harboring my property." "I am not your property," Elizabeth said, stepping beside Luke despite his attempt to keep her behind him. "I am a free American citizen, and no amount of money changes that fact." Reynolds regarded her with cold amusement. "Such spirit! You can understand why you're in such demand." "Very well, if money doesn't persuade you, perhaps information will. Deputy O'Connor, are you aware that Miss Porter is a fugitive?" Luke's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about? Miss Elizabeth Porter stands accused of theft in Boston." "Jewelry and cash taken from her father's church collection, quite the scandal in proper society. Her father agreed to my services in locating her and returning her to face the consequences of her actions, privately rather than in public court." "That's a lie," Elizabeth gasped. "I would never steal, especially not from the church." "I have the documentation to prove otherwise," Reynolds said smoothly, reaching into his coat. He produced an official-looking paper bearing what appeared to be a Boston police letterhead. "A warrant for her arrest, signed by Judge William Harrington of the Massachusetts Superior Court." Luke didn't take the offered document. "If this is legitimate, why not present it to Sheriff Wilson? Why the secrecy, the threats, the hired drovers?" Reynolds returned the paper to his pocket. "Discretion, Deputy. Pastor Porter wished to avoid public embarrassment. As for the drovers, reliable help is hard to find. They exceeded their instructions regarding Miss Porter's treatment, for which I apologize." Luke felt Elizabeth trembling beside him, though whether from fear or anger, he couldn't tell. He kept his voice level. "Even if any of that were true, which I doubt, proper procedure would be to contact local law enforcement and arrange for a legal transfer of custody. Not ambushing a woman from a stagecoach and chaining her like an animal." Reynolds' facade of civility slipped for just an instant, revealing the predator beneath. "I see reasoning with you is pointless. Very well. I had hoped to resolve this quietly, but you leave me no choice." He took a step backward. "Miss Porter, I'll be returning to Boston tomorrow. You have until sunrise to present yourself at the hotel. If you do, I promise no harm will come to Deputy O'Connor or anyone else in this charming little town. If you don't—" He let the threat hang in the air. With that, he turned and walked away, his confident stride suggesting a man unconcerned about being shot in the back. Once he was out of sight, Elizabeth sagged against Luke. "He's lying about everything," she said. "I never stole anything. My father would never hire someone like him." "I know," Luke assured her, keeping his arm around her waist to support her. "Reynolds is desperate. That means we've got him worried." They continued to Luke's cabin without further incident. The small but sturdy structure stood in a clearing backed by a steep hillside, offering excellent visibility of the surrounding area. Inside, it was simple but well-maintained, with a main room containing a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a table with 2 chairs. A doorway led to a single bedroom. "It's not much," Luke said, suddenly self-conscious about the modest accommodations. "It's perfect," Elizabeth replied, moving to the window to assess their position. "You can see anyone approaching from here." Luke nodded. "That's the idea. I'll sleep out here by the fire. You can have the bedroom." As evening approached, they shared a simple meal from the supplies Mrs. Wilson had packed. The conversation flowed easily between them, despite the circumstances, and Luke found himself sharing stories of his life before Angel's Camp, his childhood in Missouri, his service in the war, his wandering years afterward. "What made you stay here?" Elizabeth asked as they sat by the fire, the night growing cold outside. Luke considered the question. "I was tired of drifting. Sheriff Wilson offered me the deputy position when I helped him track down a gang that was robbing the mining shipments. Something about this place just felt right." "I understand that feeling," Elizabeth said softly. "Even with everything that's happened, there's something about Angel's Camp that speaks to me." Their eyes met across the firelight, and Luke felt that now familiar tug in his chest. Despite knowing her for just 2 days, he felt a connection to Elizabeth that defied rational explanation. Perhaps it was the extraordinary circumstances of their meeting, or perhaps it was something deeper, something that might have happened regardless of how they came into each other's lives. "Elizabeth," he began, not entirely sure what he intended to say. She saved him from his uncertainty by speaking first. "I'm scared, Luke. Not just for myself, but for you, for the Wilsons, for this town. Reynolds isn't going to simply give up and leave." "No, he isn't," Luke agreed. "But neither are we. The deputy marshals will be here tomorrow. Until then, we hold our ground." Elizabeth rose from her chair and moved to stand beside him. In the firelight, the bruises on her face were less visible, and Luke was struck again by her beauty, not just her physical appearance, but the strength and dignity she maintained despite everything. "If something happens to me," she said quietly, "I want you to know that these past 2 days, despite the danger, have meant more to me than any others in my life. You've shown me what true courage and decency look like." Luke stood, bringing them face to face. "Nothing's going to happen to you," he promised. "Not while I'm breathing." The intensity in his voice surprised even him. Elizabeth gazed up at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight and something more, a warmth that called to him like a beacon in the darkness. "Luke," she whispered, and somehow his name on her lips contained a question he couldn't ignore. Slowly, giving her every chance to step away, he leaned down and kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, but when her arms slipped around his neck, the kiss deepened into something more urgent, more honest than any words could express. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Luke rested his forehead against hers. "I shouldn't have done that," he said, though his tone suggested no real regret. "I'm glad you did," Elizabeth replied, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "Whatever happens tomorrow, we had this moment." A sound from outside broke the spell, a twig snapping in the darkness beyond the cabin's windows. Luke immediately went into action, extinguishing the lamp and moving Elizabeth away from potential sightlines. "Stay low," he whispered, drawing his revolver and moving toward the window. Peering carefully around the edge of the curtain, Luke scanned the moonlit clearing. At first he saw nothing. Then a shadow moved near the edge of the trees, a man crouching, rifle in hand. "Reynolds' men," Luke murmured. "At least one, probably more, surrounding the cabin. What do we do?" Elizabeth asked, her voice steady despite the fear he knew she must feel. Luke considered their options. The cabin was defensible, but they were outnumbered and potentially surrounded. Waiting for daylight might only give Reynolds more time to bring in additional men. "We need to get word to Sheriff Wilson," he decided. "There's a back way down the hill, a game trail I use for hunting. It's steep and tricky, but it bypasses the main approach." "You want us to slip away?" Elizabeth asked. Luke shook his head. "Not us. You. I'll stay and keep them occupied, make them think we're both still here. You follow the trail down to town and find the sheriff." "I won't leave you here alone," Elizabeth protested. "You have to," Luke insisted. "It's our best chance. I know these hills and I know how to handle men like these. Trust me." Elizabeth looked as though she wanted to argue further, but something in Luke's expression must have convinced her. "How do I find this trail?" Luke quickly explained the route, describing landmarks she could follow even in the dim moonlight. "Once you reach town, go straight to the jail. Don't stop for anyone or anything." Elizabeth nodded, her face resolute. "I'll bring help. I know you will." Luke brushed his fingers against her cheek. "Be careful." They moved silently to the rear of the cabin, where a small window in the bedroom offered the most concealed exit. Luke helped Elizabeth through it, then handed her his spare revolver. "You know how to use this?" he asked. "My father believed in practical education alongside spiritual guidance," Elizabeth replied, checking the cylinder with practiced ease. "I'm quite proficient." Luke couldn't help smiling despite the danger. "You're full of surprises, Miss Porter. As are you, Deputy O'Connor." She reached up and kissed him quickly. "Don't you dare die before I return." With that, she slipped into the shadows, moving toward the hillside with a stealth that impressed him. Luke watched until she disappeared into the trees, then returned to the main room to prepare for what was coming. He had barely positioned himself by the window when the first shot came, a rifle report that shattered the glass beside him. Luke dropped to the floor as more bullets splintered the window frame. "O'Connor," a voice called from the darkness. "Send out the woman and you might live to see morning." Luke recognized the voice as belonging to one of Reynolds' men, not Reynolds himself. He fired back, aiming at the muzzle flash he'd spotted among the trees. A pained cry told him his shot had found its mark. The shooting stopped momentarily, giving Luke time to move to another position. "I'm alone in here," he called out. "The woman left hours ago." "You're lying," the voice replied. "We've been watching. No one's left that cabin." Luke smiled grimly. They hadn't seen Elizabeth's escape a small advantage. "Come and see for yourself," he challenged. "Or are you afraid to face one man without hiding in the shadows?" The taunt was met with another volley of gunfire. Luke counted at least 3 different weapons. He was outnumbered, but not as badly as he'd feared. Reynolds must have kept some men in town, perhaps expecting this confrontation. For the next hour, Luke engaged in a deadly game of cat and mouse with his attackers. He changed positions frequently, fired only when he had a clear target, and managed to wound at least one more of Reynolds' men. But they were gradually closing in, working their way closer to the cabin with each exchange. Luke knew he couldn't hold them off indefinitely. His ammunition was limited, and they would eventually rush the cabin. His only hope was that Elizabeth had reached town and that help was on the way. As if answering his thoughts, new gunfire erupted from the direction of the trail, but these shots weren't aimed at the cabin. Luke heard shouts of surprise from Reynolds' men, followed by Sheriff Wilson's authoritative voice. "Drop your weapons. You're surrounded by deputies of Angel's camp." The distraction gave Luke the opportunity he needed. He burst through the cabin door, firing at the nearest attacker while diving for cover behind a woodpile. From there, he could see Wilson and 4 armed townsmen advancing into the clearing, driving Reynolds' men back toward the trees. The firefight was brief but intense. When it ended, 2 of Reynolds' men lay wounded on the ground while a third had fled into the forest. Luke emerged from his position, relieved to see Wilson unharmed. "Your timing is impeccable, Bill," he said, reloading his revolver. "Thank Miss Porter for that," Wilson replied. "She made it to town in record time, considering the terrain." He gestured toward the trail, where Elizabeth now appeared, accompanied by another deputy. Luke felt a wave of relief wash over him at the sight of her, safe and unharmed. She hurried to his side, her eyes quickly scanning him for injuries. "You're all right?" she asked anxiously. "Not a scratch," he assured her, resisting the urge to pull her into his arms in front of the others. "You did well." Wilson approached the captured men who were being tended to by one of the deputies. "Where's Reynolds?" he demanded. The men remained stubbornly silent, but their expressions told Luke what he needed to know. "He's not here," he said to Wilson. "These are just hired guns." Reynolds is still in town, Elizabeth realized. Probably at the hotel, waiting to see if his plan succeeds. Wilson nodded grimly. "Jake, you and the Peterson boys take these two back to the jail. Doc Miller can see to their wounds there." He turned to Luke. "Reynolds doesn't know his men failed yet. We might have the advantage of surprise." "My thoughts exactly," Luke agreed. He looked at Elizabeth. "You should stay here where it's safe." Elizabeth shook her head firmly. "Reynolds is after me. I won't hide while others fight my battles." Luke knew that determined expression well enough by now to recognize arguing would be pointless. "Stay close to me," he conceded. They returned to town as a group, approaching the hotel from different directions to prevent escape. The night was quiet, most of Angel's Camp's residents having retired hours ago, unaware of the drama unfolding in their midst. The hotel clerk confirmed that Reynolds was in the best room on the second floor. Wilson positioned his remaining deputies at the exits while Luke and Elizabeth accompanied him upstairs. They paused outside Reynolds' door, listening for any sound from within. "Mr. Reynolds," Wilson called, his hand on his holster. "This is Sheriff Wilson. We need to talk." Silence answered him. Wilson tried again, louder this time. When there was still no response, he nodded to Luke, who positioned himself to one side of the door. "Stand back," Wilson warned Elizabeth before kicking the door open. The room beyond was empty, the bed untouched. The window stood open, curtains billowing in the night breeze. "He's gone," Luke said, quickly checking the wardrobe and under the bed. "But his luggage is still here," Elizabeth noted, pointing to an expensive leather valise on the dresser. Luke moved to the window and looked out. A drain pipe ran down the wall nearby, an easy escape route for someone reasonably agile. "He can't have gotten far," he said. "Not on foot." Wilson was already heading for the door. "He'll be making for the livery stable. Let's move." They raced through the quiet streets, but as they rounded the corner to the livery, the sound of hoofbeats reached them, already growing distant. "Damn it," Wilson cursed. "He's got a head start." Luke made a quick decision. "Which way was he heading?" "North," Wilson replied. "Toward the mountain pass. There's an old mining road that cuts through the ridge," Luke said. "If I take the shortcut through Miller's property, I might be able to head him off before he reaches the pass." Wilson nodded. "Go. I'll follow the main road with the deputies." "I'm coming with you," Elizabeth insisted. Luke started to refuse, then saw the determination in her eyes. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Since I was a child," she replied. Minutes later, they were mounted on two of the livery's fastest horses, galloping through the moonlit landscape. Luke led them through a gap in the fence surrounding Old Man Miller's farm, then up a narrow trail that zigzagged steeply up the hillside. "The mining road runs along that ridge," Luke explained, pointing ahead as they paused to let the horses catch their breath. "It connects to the main road just before the pass. If Reynolds is heading for Sacramento, he'll have to take it." They continued upward, the horses struggling on the rough terrain. As they neared the top of the ridge, Luke slowed their pace, wary of alerting Reynolds to their presence. They dismounted, tethering the horses to a pine tree, and continued on foot until they reached a vantage point overlooking the mining road. In the moonlight, They could see the road stretching like a pale ribbon through the dark forest. For several tense minutes, they waited in silence. Then they heard it, the steady rhythm of a horse being pushed to its limits. "There," Elizabeth whispered, pointing to a lone rider emerging from the trees below. Even from a distance, Reynolds' distinctive black duster was unmistakable. He was riding hard, clearly believing he'd escaped pursuit. Luke drew his revolver. "Stay here," he instructed Elizabeth. "I'm going to cut him off at that bend in the road." "Be careful," she urged. "He's desperate now. That makes him more dangerous." Luke squeezed her hand briefly before disappearing into the underbrush. Moving with the silent efficiency of an experienced hunter, he made his way down to a point where the road curved sharply around an outcropping of rock. Positioning himself behind a boulder, Luke waited, listening as the hoofbeats grew louder. When Reynolds rounded the bend, Luke stepped out onto the road, revolver leveled. "That's far enough, Reynolds," he called. The trader reined in sharply, his horse rearing in surprise. For a moment it seemed he might try to charge past, but Luke's steady aim convinced him otherwise. "Deputy O'Connor," Reynolds said, his voice betraying only mild annoyance. "You're proving to be quite the persistent obstacle. Dismount," Luke ordered. "Slowly, hands where I can see them." Reynolds complied with exaggerated care. Once on the ground, he made a show of brushing dust from his expensive coat. "I suppose my men failed in their task." "They're enjoying Angel's Camp's hospitality in the jail," Luke confirmed. "You'll be joining them shortly." Reynolds smiled thinly. "I think not." "You see, Deputy, men in my position don't go to jail. We have arrangements." "Not in my town," Luke replied. "Angel's Camp is hardly your town," Reynolds scoffed. "It's a speck of dust that will be forgotten in a generation. Men like me build the future, while men like you cling desperately to outdated notions of justice and honor." "I'll take outdated honor over your kind of future any day," Luke said, gesturing with his revolver for Reynolds to move away from his horse. Reynolds took a careful step, then another. "One last offer, O'Connor. $5,000. Enough to start a new life anywhere you choose. All you have to do is look the other way for 5 minutes." Luke's expression remained stony. "Not interested." "Then perhaps you'll be interested in this," Reynolds said, his hand suddenly darting inside his coat. Luke fired without hesitation, his bullet catching Reynolds in the shoulder and spinning him backward. The trader fell to his knees, a derringer dropping from his hand to the dusty road. "Next one goes through your heart," Luke warned, approaching cautiously to kick the small pistol away. Reynolds clutched his bleeding shoulder, his face contorted with pain and fury. "You've made a grave mistake," he hissed. "My associates will ensure you regret this." "Your associates will be too busy running from the law to worry about revenge," came a new voice from the trees. Elizabeth emerged, Luke's spare revolver held confidently in her hands. Behind her, Sheriff Wilson and 2 deputies appeared, having followed the main road as planned. "Perfect timing as usual," Luke noted as Wilson dismounted. The sheriff surveyed the scene with satisfaction. "Caught him red-handed trying to escape, did you? And pulling a weapon on an officer of the law. That'll do nicely." As the deputy secured Reynolds, Elizabeth moved to Luke's side. "Is it over?" she asked quietly. Luke holstered his weapon and turned to her. In the fading moonlight, with dawn beginning to lighten the eastern sky, she looked both exhausted and exhilarated, a woman who had faced her worst fears and emerged victorious. "It's over," he confirmed, unable to resist reaching out to tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "Reynolds will face justice, and his operation will crumble without him." "And what happens now?" she asked, the question encompassing far more than just the immediate future. Before Luke could answer, the distant sound of an approaching stagecoach echoed through the pass. Wilson looked up from supervising Reynolds' arrest. "That'll be the morning stage from Sacramento," he said. "Probably carrying those deputy marshals I sent for." Sure enough, when they returned to Angel's camp with their prisoner, they found 2 U.S. marshals waiting at the sheriff's office. The marshals had been pursuing Reynolds for months and were delighted to find him already in custody. "You've done the federal government a great service," the senior marshal, a gruff man named Harkins, told Luke and Wilson. "Reynolds is connected to trafficking operations in 5 states. With him in custody, we can finally dismantle his entire network." "What about his claims regarding Miss Porter?" Luke asked. "He had what appeared to be a warrant from Boston." Marshal Harkins snorted. "Forgery, most likely. Reynolds has a counterfeiter on his payroll who produces convincing documents. We'll send a telegram to Boston authorities to confirm, but I'd wager my badge there's no legitimate warrant." The confirmation came 3 days later. Not only was there no warrant for Elizabeth's arrest, but Pastor Porter had been frantic with worry since his daughter's last letter mentioned her arrival in Sacramento. He was arranging to travel west immediately to reunite with her. During those 3 days, Elizabeth stayed at the Wilson home, recovering from her ordeal. Luke visited daily, and with each meeting the connection between them deepened. They spoke of her plans to remain in Angel's camp, of the town's need for a teacher, of the future that stretched before them uncertain but full of possibility. On the evening after receiving the telegram from Boston, Elizabeth and Luke walked along the ridge overlooking town. The sunset painted the sky in vibrant hues of gold and crimson, a fitting backdrop for the conversation Luke had been rehearsing in his mind all day. "I spoke with the town council," he began as they paused to admire the view. "They're prepared to offer you the teaching position officially. The old assay office can be converted into a schoolhouse by the end of the month." Elizabeth's face lit up. "That's wonderful news. I was beginning to worry they might reconsider once they learned more about my unconventional arrival in Angel's camp." Luke smiled. "If anything, that's made you something of a local legend, the Eastern lady who helped bring down a notorious criminal." "I had considerable help," she reminded him, her eyes meeting his warmly. "Elizabeth," Luke said, his voice growing serious, "I know we've known each other less than a week. Under normal circumstances, what I'm about to say would be considered rushing things. These are hardly normal circumstances," she observed, her expression encouraging him to continue. Luke took her hands in his. "When I found you in that wagon yard, something changed for me. I've spent years doing my duty, upholding the law, but never feeling truly connected to any of it or anyone until that moment." Elizabeth's eyes glistened with emotion. "I feel the same way. When you cut those ropes, you didn't just free my body, you gave me a chance at a life I never knew I wanted until I found it here. With you." Emboldened by her words, Luke continued, "I can't offer you the comforts of Boston or the security your father might wish for you. All I have is a deputy salary, a small cabin, and a promise to spend every day making sure you never regret choosing Angel's camp, choosing me." "Luke O'Connor," Elizabeth said softly, "are you asking me to marry you?" "I am," he confirmed, his heart pounding as if he were facing down a dozen armed men. "I know your father will be here within the week, and he might have other plans for you," but Elizabeth stopped his words with a kiss that left no doubt about her answer. When they finally parted, she was smiling through tears of joy. "Yes," she said simply. "1,000 times yes. Your father might need some convincing," Luke warned, though he couldn't suppress his own elated smile. "My father sent me east for a proper education so I could make my own choices in life," Elizabeth replied confidently. "Once he meets you, Once he sees the community we're building here, he'll understand this is where I belong. And she was right. Pastor Porter arrived in Angel's Camp the following week. Initially shocked by his daughter's harrowing experience, but ultimately moved by the courage and character of the community that had protected her, especially the deputy who had risked his life to ensure her freedom. The wedding took place that autumn, after Elizabeth had established herself as Angel's Camp's first proper schoolteacher. The entire town turned out for the celebration, held beneath the same apple tree where Luke and Elizabeth had sat during their first tour of Angel's Camp. Sheriff Wilson served as best man, while Mrs. Wilson, who had become like a mother to Elizabeth, helped her prepare for her new life. Pastor Porter, having extended his visit to several months, proudly walked his daughter down the aisle and delivered a sermon about divine providence that left few dry eyes in the gathering. As Luke and Elizabeth exchanged their vows, both reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had brought them together, how a moment of terrible cruelty had ultimately led to a lifetime of joy, how the simple act of cutting a rope had changed both their lives forever. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Pastor Porter declared, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." When Luke kissed his bride, the cheers from the townsfolk echoed off the distant mountains, as if Angel's Camp itself were celebrating the union of two souls who had found each other against all odds. That evening, as they stood on the porch of their cabin, expanded and improved with the help of their neighbors, Elizabeth leaned against her husband's shoulder, gazing at the stars beginning to appear in the twilight sky. "Did you ever imagine when you entered that wagon yard that this would be the outcome?" she asked. Luke's arm tightened around her waist. "Not in my wildest dreams, but I'm grateful every day that I followed the sound of that gunshot." "As am I," Elizabeth agreed. "Though perhaps we should leave that detail out when we tell our children how we met." Luke laughed, the sound reflecting the happiness that had become a constant in their lives. "Our children, is it? Planning ahead already, Mrs. O'Connor?" "Always," she replied with a smile. "I'm thinking at least 3. They'll need a proper education, of course. With the finest teacher in California as their mother, I have no doubts on that score," Luke assured her. As night fell fully over Angel's Camp, the newlyweds retired to their home, secure in the knowledge that what had begun in darkness had blossomed into a love strong enough to withstand whatever challenges the frontier might bring. For Elizabeth, the Eastern lady who had sought adventure and found her true purpose, and for Luke, the war-weary cowboy who had discovered his heart's desire while performing a simple act of human decency, the journey ahead promised to be as rewarding as it was unexpected. And in the years that followed, as Angel's Camp grew from a mining outpost to a proper town, with a schoolhouse that expanded to accommodate the children of a new generation, the story of the cowboy who found a woman chained in the wagon yard became part of local legend, a testament to the truth that even in the wildest parts of the West, justice, honor, and love could flourish in the most unlikely circumstances. By their 10th anniversary, Luke and Elizabeth had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, a thriving school with 3 teachers, and a reputation that extended throughout Calaveras County. Luke had been elected sheriff after Wilson's retirement, while Elizabeth divided her time between teaching and advocating for educational opportunities for all children in the region, regardless of background or circumstances. Their story inspired others, reminding everyone who heard it that a single act of courage could indeed change lives, not just for those directly involved, but for an entire community and the generations that would follow. And it had all begun with a gunshot in the night, a woman chained in a wagon yard, and a cowboy who had followed his conscience instead of looking the other way.